rural spaces.
It's just blocking our future and all the possibilities that are out there.
How the housing prices are rising.
It will be a combination of all themes.
We can solve everything with a good building.
We need to learn from all the master plans that failed.
How does that even look like?
Go somewhere with an open mind.
This is kind of like also the core of RURBANE REALITÄTEN.
Wenn's passiert, nicht schlimm. So. RURBANE REALITÄTEN was founded in Berlin in 2021. And what was the original motivation that you had behind your founding, and kind of what were the visions that you had at the beginning?
We both were in a very interesting place. Like, I just finished my studies and Anna just started her first job, and we met during a workshop and kind of realized that actually we were wondering about very similar things. Like, in both disciplines we felt like there's so many future challenges waiting for us, and we felt like actually we need new methods, we need kind of a new way of working to really tackle all of those challenges, and we didn't really feel like there were offices that offered that. I think it was both a little bit of just curiosity and also just maybe the want of an adventure and kind of just seeing what our contribution could be to that transformation, just trying our own projects and seeing where it leads to.
That's really interesting that you said that. Obviously, you're an architect and you're an urban planner. Do you separate those two disciplines, or how does that even work?
I think in our projects we always try to combine both of these disciplines and the different approaches, the different methods that we learned at university. And as Nelly just mentioned, we just saw the need that to tackle the future, we need to work together. So we can't stop at the end of one discipline, and then there needs to be some sort of handover, or you just start doing it as a transdisciplinary office right from the start. Yeah.
What are maybe some specific ways where you combine those two disciplines? Like, how does that even look like in your day-to-day life?
Also, kind of the initial projects where we actually saw this demand, not only in theory, but like in the hands-on world out there, was working with community projects in the countryside who want to start, cultural event spaces, community spaces where they have the ability to gather as groups, to cook together, to have performances, lectures, working spaces during the day. Or the work that we did with them was to create a participational process that would include them into the design concepts. And this is kind of like where we both met. As urban planner, like, you think a lot about processes and how to integrate different needs, and you also do this as an architect, of course, but to think in these more general approaches and then also coming up with like a spatial solution, I think this is kind of like was the foundation of our work together. Easiest way how to describe where this urban planning and architecture comes together.
Wow, that's really eye-opening for me, because I was actually really wondering how you can combine those two disciplines, because we do work together, as architects and urban planners, but it's never like one thing combined in one, which is why I think you guys are very unique in that sense, that you can really merge it together and get the best out of it. What are some of the benefits you see from the interdisciplinary approach that you guys created? What are some positive things that you can maybe tell us and for other people that want to try this?
Maybe as architects we always think that we can solve everything with a good building, and maybe as urban planners you guys think we can solve everything with a good process or with a good plan or something. And probably there's a little bit of truth in both of it, but it's also just impossible, again, to tackle those challenges in that way. So we thought, okay, we need to combine them. And I think what's really beautiful is that you see that there's so much knowledge in both disciplines, and there's so much knowledge in all the other disciplines as well. And as soon as you come together and you kind of discuss things, and like also when you bring different disciplines on board as well, you realize there's so much very, very valuable knowledge that we miss out on if we don't talk to each other, if we don't work together. And all of a sudden you realize, oh, okay, that's a smart way to look at something, or okay, that's a good idea. And I would have never come up with it because it's just not my way of thinking about things. And I think that's just an eye-opener, I think we would both highly recommend it to anyone.
For some projects, we also worked with architecture collectives or a graphic design bureau or like a more classical architecture company. And we were all sitting together at this virtual table back then. But it creates at first you need to kind of come up with a new understanding for one another. So it's kind of like learning their language and trying to understand like what their approach is, what their methods are. And this creates like a huge openness in your mind and is the gate opener to inspiration and to innovative formats. And this is something that we really appreciate, because when you're only sticking around with your urban planners or your architects, there is no innovation happening.
Do you have some projects where it was challenging to combine two disciplines and the way of thinking in different way was rather a negative aspect than positive?
I mean, there are some aspects I'm thinking about, like we did in various projects. One of them is that wasn't really getting in a spatial approach or like ending up in a spatial concept. This was more about like bringing people together so that they get to know each other, that they see, you know, the potential for both sides of a project. This is kind of like the first initial step towards like a shared future, and that they are both contributing, both parties. And I would say this is not very concrete, but it's also necessary if you want to have both sides happy in the end, let's say, when they come together in this project. And there's different aspects in projects we did that were more like design approach, which is kind of more like on the architecture side, but we still come back to the demands of the people and we still learn with each other. And it's also nice to have the manpower and our backs and exchange and learn new things just between the two of us in our everyday praxis. But also with each project that we do, we learn new things.
You work in the context of a rural and urban transformation process. How do you ensure that your participation formats are successful in both rural and urban aspects?
Obviously, that's a question that we also wonder about a lot, but we also try to not focus too much on what's the difference between those places, because actually the rural and the urban, the challenges are sometimes more similar than you would think. And obviously the context is very different, but then again, if you just look into rural areas, even within that space, there's so many differences in so many different rural spaces that have very, very different challenges within that. So what we always try to do is to go to the place and try to understand what's actually there, and not say, oh, this is a rural space or this is an urban space, and therefore we already know what the solution will be. So I think that's really how we try to approach it, is to go somewhere with an open mind, and also rather than already knowing the solution when you arrive, actually listening and trying to understand, and also just stay open.
Now you've like sparked my curiosity a bit. What are the challenges that are similar between those two spaces? Because you just mentioned that they're similar.
What we're really interested in is how people live together. And what do we need in order to create healthy, sustainable, and also just socially rich environments. And I think both in rural and in urban areas, that's something that people are longing for, and that's also really heavily contributes to a healthy society, is when you have those spaces. So when you talk to people about how to create them, I think the needs and the wishes for that are very similar. But obviously when you look into rural spaces, maybe sometimes mobility or infrastructure is more of an issue, but therefore you have maybe really great social clubs and also people doing things in their free time, whereas in urban spaces maybe you have just more frequencies, like you have more people around, so when you create an offer it's more likely that people show up. And so those things you have to take into consideration. But I think in the core of it, the needs of people and what they're longing for is very similar.
Another example would be like the change of time. You can see things happening or transition happening in the cities and also in the countryside in different levels. But vacant commercial buildings where you have these massive buildings in the city that need new usages, because the whole way we do like online shopping these days is changing. And this is something that you can see in both worlds, let's say. But there is innovation happening in the cities and also in the countryside. So there is new solutions and innovative approaches in both of these worlds. And this is kind of like also the core of RURBANE REALITÄTEN, that we think both of these worlds as one and see them connected to each other rather than apart.
Could you please give us an example of the project where it will be a combination of both themes? about rural environment and urban environment, and how can it be in the same space already?
We were asked to do a workshop in a little village in Brandenburg. They are planning to create a lot of new housing there, which means that a lot of people that are currently living in the city will move to that village, which also means that basically the number of the population will double in size by that. So obviously you have the people that lived in the countryside, like a rural environment almost for all of their lives, so they're kind of the locals there, and then all of a sudden you have a big group of people that will move there that have more of an urban background. We were asked to do a workshop where both of those groups meet before the new people move to the village. So kind of to start that conversation, to start a dialogue. And I think there you could really see how in the beginning of the workshop, both groups had very strong, let's say, opinions about each other and kind of expectations and views and maybe also fears about how the change is going to be. The people moving to the village were afraid of like, how will they integrate there? Will people be open enough? And so on. And by the end of the workshop, it was really interesting. We used different methods. We thought of a good way to visualize like the different ideas that people came with. And in the end, the main focus was actually the similarities between both groups. And that actually it's not so much about the urban or the rural, or it's actually about how people want to live their life. And as soon as they realize that actually they both bring something to the table that everyone can learn from, like both sides can learn from each other. So for example, the people moving to the village are very interested in like how to create their own gardens, and I think the people that were already living in the village were scared that actually they wouldn't be interested at all and they just want to do their own thing. And like throughout that process you realize that actually both worlds aren't so far apart. You just have to be willing to talk to each other and understand each other and maybe also learn from each other. Long answer.
No, but
That's interesting.
I've never thought of it like that. That's very eye-opening, because at least from my experience in architecture school, you always just like, you get a site and then there's some neighbors and then like that's it, and you're in the site with those 6 people that live next to you, and that's kind of it. But when you really conduct these workshops and learn about the different people, like as you said, and actually bring them together, I think that's super. So talking about challenges, when designing for more rural spaces, what are some of the difficulties that you encounter, like, and how do you solve them, maybe?
I think there is literally no answer to that because, I mean, the countryside is so diverse. So every village, every like small town you go to has their own problems and their own potential, and we just go and see what's there and start from that.
Coming back to the cultural spaces that we try to or help to develop, I think that's a common issue that you meet in a lot of rural spaces at the moment, is that there's a lot of investment and development happening in building like new built housing. It's like one family homes and so on and so forth. But the actual old village centers, they're often kind of turning into empty spaces. So you see a lot of empty former shops or a lot of former pubs, probably more like small restaurants where people used to really meet and spend their free time. A lot of them closed over the pandemic because they just didn't survive that kind of time. And now those spaces are missing in a lot of villages. And the need for that and the importance of that, I think people are more and more aware of it, especially now, like in the political times that we live in at the moment. You really need to ensure that every village and every space has a place where people can come together and actually just also literally just meet each other, and for there to be the chance of a conversation. When those places are missing, it's much harder to understand the other position. And views can get very extreme and hardened very quickly when you actually just don't meet each other anymore. And so I think that's an issue, for example, that we really try to actively get involved in. So we specifically go to rural environments or rural spaces where there's maybe not the best infrastructure or financial conditions, try to really help people that are trying to change that or like trying to create those meeting places. And I think we feel like it's always a very valuable.
Obviously, you two are already professionals at this dynamic between the urban and the rural, as if I may say that. What are maybe some trends that you see in the development of those areas, or kind of their interaction with each other?
I think probably our view on them. I think they've been connected forever, but now is the time to actually think them as one also, and not to have this division between city and countryside anymore in our heads, because it's just blocking our future and all the possibilities that are out there if you're connecting both worlds. And this is what so many people are actually doing, not just since Corona, that they kind of like have this mobile workspaces and they can work from wherever and choose to live in the countryside now. Yeah, this is just happening since a long time now, and it's also, when you think about sustainable development, just the way to go, you know, have to see this future in a combined interconnected world, and not only focus on the city and all the challenges and the problems and politics, just talking about cities anymore.
I think it's also really interesting that things become much more fluid between both places. As Anna already said, working models are changing. I think maybe to add to that, if we look especially into the cities at the moment with how the housing prices are rising, a lot of people just also can't afford living there anymore. And if you combine that with the possibility of remote working, all of a sudden there's just a shift happening that's a really, really interesting transformation process that's ahead of us. And I think we're both really passionate about thinking about how to shape that transformation.
What is the hardest challenge right now in the field?
I think maybe sometimes a challenge for us with our work is that we still have to explain why we do the kind of work that we do. Because I'm an architect, Anna's an urban planner. Why don't we just build buildings and plan plans? And it sounds weird, but it's honestly one of the things that we have to spend the most time on, is actually explaining why the things that we do, the topics, and also our methods, why they're necessary. That sometimes is a challenge for us. But we also see that we have already observed in the time that we are doing what we do, that mindset is really shifting. And we can see, like, when you read, doesn't matter if it's like political papers or like if you read in the press, or you see like also in our fields how people start to talk both about rural spaces but also about new methods, you realize that actually a lot of people start to understand that we need to think outside of the box a little bit sometimes.
Your work includes formats for dialogue and interaction. What methods do you use to make complex ideas and future visions understandable?
It's a good question, because that's something that we really think about a lot, because all of the future challenges are very complex and there are a lot of things to consider, especially when you think about how to shape processes, how to shape transformation. There's so many factors that go into that. And so what we try to do is always to work in formats and methods that are, first of all, approachable, so that are open, a lot of people are able to participate. And that sounds easy, but it's actually really hard to do. And then the second thing is that when we have a lot of people coming together, or also a lot of issues that we or factors that we have to consider, we try to find a way where it becomes tangible, like either visualizing it or creating a format where people can actively do something, because by doing you also sometimes start thinking differently. Yeah, but we're also still learning and curious and kind of thinking about, okay, how can we explain this complex thing, or how can we visualize that, or how can we maybe also help people to translate what they are already thinking or wanting in a way that helps others to get involved, and so on and so forth. So I think...
Can you provide an example of a particularly successful method or a format that you have developed to translate specific information that you want to translate?
Beginning of last year, we were working with a cultural center called Ewerk in a small town that is called Luckenwalde in Brandenburg. And right next to this cultural center, there is a vacant building, super beautiful architecture from the 20s, and it's used to be a swimming pool. And it is actually like a very important place, because everyone who lives in Luckenwalde learned how to swim there. There's a lot of memories, not only good ones, but also bad ones. And within the project, this building is also supposed to become a cultural event center in the future. And what we did in the project, which was called Phase Null, so the initial moment, to create an initial moment before coming up with the plans to open up the space and to invite everyone who is interested to come and see and let them know that there is like something happening in the future, and then they're free to engage and bring in their own concept and own views. And what we did, I mean, it all ended up in a performance, but beforehand we were talking a lot to people in Luckenwalde, and they all shared their memories, and we learned so much about this place that you could not like read in any book or in the newspaper. It's just created by all these memories from the people. And we invited them to the performance, and they all shared their stories. And this was kind of like the moment of looking back and talk about this place, what it used to be. And then we created a moment where everyone was allowed to enter the swimming pool, and this was like the first shared moment that they're like walking in there, and there was fog everywhere, and you could hear the music playing from back in the days, and you had like this chlorine smell in the air. So it was like a very atmospheric performance. It was the first step into the shared future, into what nobody knows even what it's going to be yet. And it was a really nice moment, because this was kind of the first day over a long time that people were actually allowed to enter this building again. And that was a very nice moment to see that there were so many people coming and actually being interested in what is going on, and a lot of fun doing that project. We really have to mention that it's not just solely our project. We've also been working with a dramaturg, and that was also coming back to interdisciplinary, which is a lot of fun then to come up with these kind of new formats and approaches.
No, but I love that. I think that's what made it so lively and interesting, probably, because we really can't come up with all these innovative concepts when we just are stuck in our own bubble, as Nelly said before. I think that was a really important thing to mention, so I'm really glad you guys did that and shared it with us. Working with such participatory projects, and like kind of where you involve a lot of different people and you bring them together and you make workshops, where did that come from, this interest?
I think it kind of started with realizing that we need new methods, also kind of new abilities as both urban planners and architects. I think for us, coming up with sustainable solutions also means it has to be socially sustainable. And once people identify with their surroundings and the spaces that they live in, there's a very different way of engagement, which makes the processes more resilient when more people have a say in it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really fascinates us in a way to enable more people access to how the future is going to look like. Because why should a few decide on the living space of so many? And I think that's one of our main drivers is to open that process. And also, I'd say that we don't really believe in solutions. I think we really believe in processes, because both architecture, urban planning, all of those disciplines, they are slow. If you come up with a solution for a problem that you see now, and it takes 10, 20, sometimes 30 years to actually make that happen, build a building or translate a plan, whatever, like sometimes it takes decades to actually see the first results of something. And so the solution that you came up with might not actually work in any kind of way in 10 years' time. And so it's we really believe that rather than coming up with a solution and say, okay, this is going to be it, we need to put processes in place. And for those processes to work, you really need people on board, and you need their opinions, you need their needs, and you need their views, because that will ensure that even in 5 years or in 10 years, there will be people who will constantly shift the direction a little bit in a way that will lead to a better outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think at some point we need to learn from all the master plans that failed. And if you think about like this process-oriented approach, this is just way more how life works, you know? There's you can't foresee everything. And if you also, as a discipline, not see you as, the almighty and who's coming up with the perfect plan and the solution, and then you're out, your job is done, you're getting paid, and that's it. This is not how it works in the end. We see ourselves we enable people to realize their visions, their ideas, and it's more like a long-term approach and following up with developments that are happening. This goes hand in hand with participation, for sure. I mean, it's everyone's talking about resilience, and this is probably it to think in a process-oriented way, because this is actually how you ensure that sustainability is kind of taken into place.
Maybe just to add to that, I think why we think in that way has a lot to do that in our generation we'll have to deal with much more of what's already existing. We don't really have the luxury of deciding to just plan a massive new building and just say, you know what, that's going to be the solution for this problem. We kind of need to deal with what has already been built, because also we need to think about how we use our resources, how also we need to consider obviously climate change, the housing crisis, all of those things. I think that's also why we believe in processes, because they are the only way to deal with really complex situations that are already there and that are kind of just handed over to our generation now, and we're supposed to deal with it. So.
And the last question will be how it could be to work together, doing the project with other person. And in general, we are used to work with each other for a group of 3 or 4 persons in our studies. The question would be, would you like to name us pros and cons, or would you like only pros to be in the project together with other person?
I think, yeah, I mean, that's where we started, right? We both would have never been self-employed just all by ourselves. So, I mean, there are so many challenges waiting for you in self-employment on so many different levels that it's always just nice to have a sparring partner and to exchange. But I think on our hands-on projects, we're kind of, it's nice to disagree, you know, this is how the project grows, and sometimes we have different opinions on things and we come up with an even better solution afterwards. So, and this is kind of the creative approach or methods that we're working with, where you really need this exchange, and it's also a lot of fun. So this is my contribution.
I think it's definitely so valuable to do this together, because there's not only from our disciplines, the knowledge that we bring, but also just to have, it's really a support system that you are for each other. And I think that's really, really valuable. And I also enjoy us being kind of the core of it, just being 2 people, because we can really discuss, and also we can find solutions together, but we also don't consider us as just 2 people at all times. So we always are open to collaborate, to if we have a project and we feel you know what, actually it would be really great to bring one more person in, or kind of to ask those people, or to see what, it's the 2 of us, but there's always the chance to bring more people on board. And I think that's also something that's really fun and kind of that keeps it exciting and different, and kind of also in each project.
Thank you.
Wait, I want to say one last thing. When you said one sentence, it really felt to me like it embodied everything that you guys do and everything that this whole interview is supposed to represent. Why should the few decide on the living space of many? I think that's really powerful, and that's really important to remember as an architect, as an urban planner, and as anyone that builds. So, thank you for that.
Or not builds.
Or doesn't build. Just remember. Thank you. Agreed, yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
That was so